Man in the Norfolk Jacket by Anonymous. Published in the Evening Express on the 27th of January 1902. Read by Bethina. Since the hour of our arrival, I certainly had not seen much of Chelden, but the little I had seen I did not like. My great-aunt and I had driven from the station through street after street of gorgeous shops which reminded me of Regent Street. They were varied by great straight houses, all duplicates of each other, the inhabitants of which might be relied on to give Chelden air that subtle influence which kills the germ of any attempt to wear old and comfortable blouses such as my soul loved, and to scramble over the rocks in disreputable skirts and shoes. My venerable relative took a different view. She leaned forward and surveyed the prospect from the carriage window with a beaming countenance. "Just what we heard, Agatha," she observed with a grunt of satisfaction. "You can see there are plenty of good people here, new as the place is." "Yes," I said mournfully, "you can." We are fated by my great-aunt's decree to spend 6 weeks at Chelden, and I had hoped against hope that, being a recently developed watering place, it might have succeeded in maintaining some of its original wildness. But my hopes died a prompt and painful death on our arrival, and my despondency grew deeper and deeper, until, having established my aunt to rest with a cup of tea by her side in her room, I departed to my own and walked up to the window. I glanced out, and then, with a gasp of delight, threw up the sash and leaned my arms on the sill, and contemplated the prospect with joy in my heart. Right and left of me stretched great white cliffs, sweeping in a wide bend round gleaming waves that rolled in long columns up the beach, tossing surf high into the air. Beyond the bay I could catch glimpses of more towering cliffs, and blue water and brown rocks, and, joy of joys, of boats by the score. I had forgotten in my first dismay at the sight of this new London by the sea, that provided it be by the sea, even a London had possibilities of boating, and I loved boating with the undivided affection of a heart which had never gone out to tennis or golf, or even with any special warmth to my bicycle. I surveyed the distant vessels with an inward resolve to make the acquaintance of some of them with as little delay as might be. Luckily my aunt approved of this taste of mine. In fact, it stood out in solitary glory from the rest of my pursuits as the only one blessed with her unqualified sanction, and next morning I proposed a row, with the comfortable conviction that no impediment was likely to be placed in my way. Aunt Catherine acquiesced readily enough. "I even think, my dear, that I shall come with you," she observed. "I have a little surprise for you, dear Agatha. Before we left, I ordered a sweet yachting suit, so I shall be quite able to go with you the whole time we are here." I regretted the yachting suit. My aunt's taste in dress was peculiar, and I was not surprised when she appeared in a sailor blouse, cut with a low collar of blue cloth, liberally embroidered with golden anchors, a narrow skirt with anchors of a large size lavishly sprinkled round, and a peaked cap surmounting her grey hair. However, it could not be helped, so we started for the beach, Aunt Catherine speedily becoming, to her evident satisfaction, the observed of all observers. I saw one man, who was leaning his back against the esplanade railings, suddenly straighten up and glance at us with the air of one who had found a new interest in life. Aunt Catherine did not see him, but if she had, she would have set down the dawning smile on his handsome face as one of unqualified admiration. He surveyed her deliberately, and then half turned his head as though about to draw his companion's attention to the scene, when he unexpectedly met my indignant eyes. The enormity of his behaviour evidently came home to him. The smile died away, his tanned cheek flushed a little, and he even raised his hand towards his cap. Was the man, after his insolent stare, about to complete his crime by acknowledging it with an apology? I gave him an annihilating glance, which appeared to take effect. He picked up his cane and walked off in the opposite direction, and Aunt Catherine pursued her way, smilingly complacent and quite unaware of my championship. My hot cheeks cooled when we went down amongst the boats, and my eyes fell on every variety of small craft, sailing and rowing. Our knowledge was limited, but our enthusiasm was not, and when I caught sight of a boat which lay well apart from the others, I fell in love with her on the spot. She was pretty and lightly built, but in spite of the fact that she seemed nearly new, looked as if she had not been lately used. Her light sculls lay within her, but were blistered by the sun, and the blisters were all on one side, as if the position of the boat were never changed. But she looked so pretty and superior to the other boats introduced to our notice that I made up my mind that we would have her, if by good luck she were not a private boat. I walked up to the boatman, who was discoursing to my aunt, and indicated my discovery with outstretched sunshade. "Can we have the Seabird?" I remarked. "She's a pretty boat and," with sudden inspiration, "won't be half so heavy for you to pull as this one." Such a consideration should, I thought, win the day, for I knew that Aunt Catherine would insist on the presence of an official boatman. She did not regard my powers of rowing from my point of view. The man looked across at me with a startled glance. "She ain't mine," he replied curtly. "Is she private?" I demanded. "Well, no, she ain't exactly what you might call private, miss. She belonged to the sailing club, but they sold her to one of my mates, and he don't like her." He stopped abruptly and began to pull down his boat towards the sea. "Beautiful morning," he observed affably. "It's a pity the owner isn't about," Aunt Catherine said with a wistful glance at the graceful Seabird. "We'll try and find him next time, Agatha. I expect this man's jealous. Anyone would like such a boat." Whether our friend heard the remark or not, I could not say, but when we landed a couple of hours later, he jerked his thumb towards my libelled craft. "My mate'll never take you out in that, ladies," he said impressively. "He's trying to make the sailing club take her back, else he'd have smashed her long ago. 'Spect he will in the end anyhow," he added, after a reflective pause. "What a shame," I said. "She's seaworthy, isn't she?" He paused in the act of inserting a lever under the keel of the boat. "Well, yes, miss, she's what you might call seaworthy enough, but she's known as—" But just as I was about to learn the reason of the boatman's unjust prejudice against the Seabird, Aunt Catherine sailed down on me and took my arm. "Good morning, my man," she said. "Come, Agatha, it is lunch-time." She pulled me away and lectured me on my objectionable habit of entering into conversation with low people until we reached our hotel. But my boatman, on whom I soon began to look with a proprietary eye, for I hired his boat nearly every day, was a communicative old fellow, and told me many a story of the sea and of the fishers' quarter of Chalden. But try as I would, I never succeeded in persuading him to let me have the Seabird on behalf of his mate, or even to give me any good or satisfactory reason why I should not. After a little he allowed me to take a boat out by myself, and I spent many a dreamy hour lazily rowing about the beautiful bay, or lying on my back staring up at the sky, which was hardly bluer than the water that rippled softly under my boat. I was returning late one afternoon from a solitary daydream on the waves, which had consumed fully 2 hours. Dusk was falling, and the inhabitants of Chalden had forsaken the beach and esplanade for the greater attractions of the dinner and tea-table. I reflected with some dismay that I should probably be late for table d'hôte, a serious fault in Aunt Catherine's eyes, so I pulled my boat hastily beyond the reach of the waves and prepared to make the best of my way back. As I did so, I glanced round the long stretch of the deserted beach. There was hardly a figure to be seen, except here and there in the distance a fisherman smoking a meditative pipe as he lounged amongst his nets, but as my eyes finally fell on the Seabird, lying in her isolation at some distance from the other boats, I saw a man's tall figure standing by her. Evidently one of the former owners, for though his Norfolk jacket and dark tie were not distinctive, he wore the unmistakable badge of the sailing club on his straw hat. Even at the distance I was from him, I could see the silver flag shine out from the dark ribbon to which it was fastened. I hesitated a moment, looking at the little boat with longing eyes. After all, why should I not ask this gentleman if I might not use her? He could no doubt tell me. I tucked back some unruly locks of hair which the wind had loosened and turned in his direction. As I approached, I saw that he had stooped down and was examining one of the sculls. I could see his dark, clear-cut face, hardly a good face, and I paused. He must have heard me and would look up, but apparently he was too absorbed to hear anything, for he continued his examination for fully 2 or 3 minutes. Then he slowly raised himself and, to my great indignation, looked straight at me, turned quickly away, and in another minute I lost sight of him beyond a breakwater. So much for appearances, I thought. He had looked like a gentleman, but no gentleman would bestow such an undeserved snub on a lady who, he must have seen, wished to make an inquiry of him. I sent a wrathful wish after the young man that somebody might be found who would teach him manners, but as I ran up the sand towards our hotel, a new thought struck me. I would come down at dusk the next day and take the seabird out without leave, since I could not do so with due permission. I laughed gleefully to myself. If that young man came past next evening, he should find the seabird gone. I took nobody into my confidence. Such a plot I considered was most likely to be successful when there was only one conspirator. But the next evening everything seemed to work rightly for the scheme. Aunt Catherine had fallen in with some ancient schoolfellows of hers and had asked them to dine, and I had not much difficulty in getting leave of absence. "Though really, Agatha," she remarked, "you are getting inconsiderate. I know the girls would have liked to see you." "I'm sure to see them, you know, Auntie," I suggested humbly. The girls were mature maidens of over 70 years of age, and I felt that the meeting would be quite as enjoyable even if delayed. However, after a slight demur, Aunt Catherine agreed to this view of the case, and I stole out a little before dusk, with a feeling of guilty joy, and took my way towards the forbidden seabird. No dark and ill-mannered young man was bending over her this evening. No one of any kind was within hail, though at some distance I saw a man sitting in a canoe, whom I recognised as the individual whose face had expressed an unholy joy on catching sight of my aunt's nautical attire. But no boatman was near, and I laid my hand on the dainty seabird and pushed her into the water with very little difficulty. It was earlier than the hour of my return yesterday, and the last slanting rays of the sun cast a golden glory across the waves. The seabirds slipped lightly over their crests, with a joyful dancing movement that set my heart dancing too, and brought a ripple of laughter to my lips. This was certainly very different to the slow, heavy boat my old boatman had hitherto supplied me with. It might be that my pleasure was stolen, but it was undeniable pleasure. I rowed out to a considerable distance from the shore, and then pulled in my sculls and prepared to allow the current to carry me whither it would. It was a charming evening. A faint westerly breeze flickered over the water, and the air was full of fresh sunset warmth. A sense of contented well-being seemed to pervade me, and the world in general, and I regret to say that I felt no single qualm of conscience for my unprincipled kidnapping of the sea-bird. Turning my eyes landward for a minute, I could see a few figures sauntering near the edge of the water, and I waved my handkerchief gaily and derisively in case some of the distant forms might be engaged in a search for the missing boat. I stood up to do so, and as I sat gingerly down again, for I had no wish to upset myself, I turned slightly towards the seat behind me, and suddenly my eye was caught by the edge of a dark sleeve. I was so startled that I forgot my caution and turned sharply round, nearly capsizing the boat. On the seat in the stern sat a young man, dressed in a dark Norfolk jacket and wearing a straw hat with the badge of the sailing club. I had no difficulty in recognising the thin, dark face or the deep-set eyes with the bad look which had struck me before. For an instant my heart stood still. How had he managed to enter the boat without my seeing him as I pushed off? Once in, he might not have had much difficulty in remaining concealed, for I had not glanced behind me. But how and why had he got in? Then the impertinence of his conduct struck me forcibly. I am not naturally a cowardly girl, and as I reflected on the outrageous coolness of this young man, I forgot my fear. He had apparently no intention of apologising either. Well, I would soon bring him to book. After all, I was in no danger. A glance round showed me a canoe which would be quite within a long hail, so I sat down and looked at him, prepared to bring home to him the true aspect of such reprehensible behaviour. "Are you aware," I began, fixing him with an indignant eye, "that you are an absolute stranger to me? How dare you have the insolence to force your company upon me?" I began with the true ring of righteous wrath in my tone, but somehow, as I sat facing that inscrutable figure with the eyes fixed beyond me, the words tailed off into an ignominious quiver. Still, they were undoubtedly what the situation required, but they had no effect whatsoever on my unwelcome companion. He simply took no more notice than if I had not been there, until a minute or two later, as I was wondering how I should succeed in divining his intentions if he turned out to be deaf and dumb, I saw his expression change. His lips, long, thin, cruel lips, suddenly curved into a smile. His deep-set eyes glowed with an evil fire. I sat looking at him, feeling suddenly as if some awful fate were overshadowing me. I tried to scream, but only an indistinct murmur came from my lips. I felt no doubt now that I had to do with a lunatic. The extraordinary thing was that the man never looked at me. With the smile still hovering round his mouth, he half rose, slowly and stealthily from his seat, and took a club from his pocket. The next instant he leaned forward and brought it crashing down on someone, which was it, at the other end of the boat. There was nothing there, yet the club seemed to encounter something about 3 feet above the seat. There was a sickening thud, a groan that seemed to come from a woman's dying lips, and as my horrified eyes watched the brandished club descend, they fell too on a shadowy outline of a woman's figure, falling to the bottom of the boat, a figure over which the man was stooping with an exultant joy in his face. I could bear no more. With an effort I broke the spell of the frozen, silent horror which seemed on me, and sent a wild cry ringing over the water, a cry which seemed to echo in my ears, and then I suppose I must have fainted. At any rate, when I next opened my eyes, they encountered another face, a man's face this time also, but the murderer I had seen before had vanished. A canoe was alongside, empty, and sitting in the bow of the Seabird was the man who had silently ridiculed Aunt Catherine's yachting dress. But I did not care. If he ridiculed mine, I should not have objected in the least at that moment. I was so glad to see someone who would save me. He was holding the 2 boats together with one hand, and regarding me with alarmed concern writ large in his face. From the soaked condition of his cap, and the fact that I was lying in a small puddle of water, I judged that with his free hand he had been endeavouring to administer the proper treatment for a fainting fit. But I did not stop to take in details at first. I sat up and caught frantically at his arm with both my hands, gasping out wild and incoherent appeals to him to protect me, and concluding this exhibition of sane and ladylike behaviour by bursting into hysterical sobs. I imagine my fears as to the presence of a lunatic must have been transferred to him at that moment, though he assures me now that I never looked sweeter, which of course is absolute nonsense. But whatever he thought, he showed great presence of mind. "It's all right," he remarked as he contemplated my tears. "Don't be so upset. Everything's all right, I assure you. Look here, don't you want to put on your hat? You'll catch cold." He fished it up from where it had fallen, and I put it on, and began to feel ashamed of myself. "Only do take me in," I observed between my sobs. "He may come back." My companion regarded me curiously. "Who may?" he asked. "What frightened you? You shouldn't have come out in this boat if you're imaginative." Imaginative indeed. "I saw him murder her," I cried, shivering. "I saw it myself." Tom Rayner, I learnt his name that day, looked at me in silence a moment. Then he gave a little laugh. "You have no doubt heard the story of this boat," he said. "It is certainly very horrible, and I don't much wonder at your imagination conjuring up the scene. But you really need not be so upset. You see, it's all over a long time ago." The half-contemptuous pity of this tone did me good. I was not going to be treated as a foolish child, and in this resolve a little of the horror that had so shaken me died away. "I never heard any story," I declared, "only they never would let me use this boat, and so tonight I took it, and he came." I supplemented this disjointed statement with a few others equally disjointed, but somehow Mr. Rayner seemed to glean a clear idea of what had happened, a result which certainly did credit to his intelligence. When he had satisfied himself that I had never heard any story attaching to the sea-bird, he looked grave, and after a reflective pause began to search his pockets, and finally produced a ball of fishing twine. "We'll tow the canoe behind," he said cheerfully, "and I'll pull you back." My entreaties that he would tell me all he knew about the sea-bird had no effect whatsoever. He smiled indulgently, observed in matter-of-fact tones that there was nothing to be alarmed at, and that I must not think any more of my imaginary adventures, and proceeded to discourse on Aunt Catherine in much the same style that he would have employed if our introduction had been in less unusual circumstances. We saw a good deal of him after that. In fact, he says he can never regret my having taken out the sea-bird that evening, but it was not until we had left Chelden and its associations behind and were back in prosaic London that he told me the history of the sea-bird. She had been the property of the Chelden Sailing Club until 6 months before our visit to the place. About that time she was taken out one evening by a member of the club named Richard Greer. He was the dark-faced young fellow wearing a Norfolk jacket and the badge of the club upon his hat, a man disliked amongst the other members for his revengeful temper and easily roused anger. He had been seen to enter the boat in company with the girl to whom he was engaged. His return was not observed, but from that day the girl disappeared, and a railway accident in which he was killed only a few days afterwards prevented the matter being cleared up. But from that time the sea-bird became unusable, for though sometimes for weeks together she could be taken out and her passengers saw and heard nothing, at others the terrible tragedy, which had no doubt taken place through some fit of fury on Greer's part, was re-enacted as it had been on the fateful evening when I had beheld it. I have never again been to Chelden. Tom told me the story, but refuses to declare his belief in the apparitions. Nevertheless, his professed scepticism is contradicted by the fact, which I have since discovered, that he called at the sailing club the following day, and, as a result, the sea-bird was destroyed that night. My taste for solitary boating excursions has vanished, but it does not matter, for my husband is always ready to accompany me, and I certainly think that two are company, whatever 3 or 1 may be. I hope you enjoyed this story. If so, please remember to click the like button and consider subscribing to my channel. And, as always, thank you for listening.